Hi, I'm Jann Newton from Newton Custom Interiors, and I want to welcome you to this Learn How to Sew course. Sewing can be such a fun hobby. If you love to decorate like I do, learning how to sew your own home decor projects like draperies and bedding and pillows is a great way to save money. You're going to have several skills that you learn in this course, starting all the way from how to thread your sewing machine to sewing a straight stitch, learning how to put in a buttonhole, and by the end of the course, you're going to have the basic skills that you need to sew your own home decor projects. So let's get started with the course. I'm going to show you the different parts on my sewing machine, which is a Singer Heavy Duty 4411. Your sewing machine may look a little different, but you're probably going to have basically the same parts. They just may be in a different place on your sewing machine. I like this machine. I picked it out because it has metal parts on the inside instead of plastic like most home machines do. So it's a little bit heavier, and when I sew, the machine doesn't shake too much, which I like. It's also sews faster than a lot of other home machines sew, and also it will go through heavier fabrics than a lot of the home machines will. One of the most important things that you're going to get with your sewing machine is the owner's manual. And I do not usually like to read owner's manuals, but this is really an important one to go through. It's going to show you the different parts of your sewing machine and also the different features. And probably it will have a troubleshooting guide. So if you're having problems with your sewing machine or with sewing, hopefully you will find the answers in the troubleshooting guide. So let's get started with our course. Here's the needle of the sewing machine, probably one of the most important parts of the machine. And underneath the needle is the presser foot. And it does exactly what it says. It presses down on the fabric so that the feed dogs, which are underneath the presser feet, can pull the fabric through the machine. Usually there's a lever on the back that will help you raise and lower the fabric or the presser foot. My bobbin is a drop-in bobbin. Some machines are a side-loading bobbin, and usually that is, if you take off the extension table, that's in the front here. Usually on the front of your machine, you'll have a reverse lever. You can use this to back up while you're sewing. On my machine, I also have a dial for the different stitches, the straight stitch, zigzag, some decorative stitches, and then the buttonhole stitches. This dial up here is for the stitch length. On the top of your sewing machine, you may have a dial for the width of the zigzag stitch, a dial for your needle position. There are 3 different positions. You'll mainly use this middle position. You'll use the other ones when you make buttonholes. You'll also have a dial for the tension of the top thread in your machine, and this is very important. You want to make sure the tension is correct so that your top and bottom threads are sewing together nicely. This is the take-up lever. You have a diagram for how to thread up here. This right here is to change the tension of the presser foot. This is the spool holder to hold your thread, and this is the bobbin winder. On almost every machine, on the side, you'll have what's called a flywheel, and this will raise and lower the needle of your machine. you always want to turn it towards the front, towards yourself when you turn it. On the side of my machine, I also have a left and right side balance for when making buttonholes. I have an on-off switch and then the plug-in for the electricity and the foot control pedal. On the back of the machine, I wanted to show you again the pressure foot lifter that we were talking about earlier. So this just raises and lowers the presser foot. This one has an extra adjustment. If you have heavier fabrics, it will lift the foot up even higher. In this first lesson of the Learn How to Sew course, I'm going to show you how to thread your sewing machine. And before I get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of safety things. I think it's a really good idea to make sure that your sewing machine is not on when you're threading your sewing machine. You don't want to accidentally press on the pedal and sew through your finger, which, believe me from experience, I know that that can happen with the sewing machine. So before you start threading, make sure that your machine is turned off. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about different size needles for your sewing machine. My sewing machine came with basic size 14 needles, and your machine may have come with 12 or 14. Those are the medium basic needles that you'll need for most sewing projects. They're good for sewing cottons or polycotton blends or linen fabrics. But if you are sewing a lighter weight fabric, such as a silk, then you're going to want a smaller needle, like a size 11. And then if you're sewing heavier fabrics, such as a denim, you may want to jump up to a size 16 needle. That will help you go through the fabric a little bit easier. So when I bought my machine, I also bought extra needles in the different sizes that I thought I might need for my projects. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about the thread that I prefer to use when sewing. I like 100% polyester thread. It's really strong and it won't break very easily. And I like two different brands. I like the 𝗪𝗓𝗏 brand. They have a lot of different colors, and so it's a good strong thread to use. And then also Coats & Clark has a dual duty thread that comes in lots of colors too, and it's also a good thread. So let's get started with learning how to thread your sewing machine. Before we start threading the machine, I wanted to tell you that I'm going to use two different thread colors. One red for the bobbin and then black for the top thread. And the reason I'm going to do that is so that you can see better in the video the two different threads and what they're doing. When you thread your machine, you're going to probably want to match your thread to your fabric. So we're going to put the red thread on the spool holder. Put the cap on, but you don't want it to be too tight. And we're going to go over to the first metal guide, thread guide. And then this is our bobbin tension discs. So you can see I've got instructions on the top of my machine as to how the thread goes through those tension discs. So I'm going to come around the front clockwise, go around the discs, and then it's going to head over to the bobbin winder. One thing I wanted to show you before we start winding our bobbin is when you engage this bobbin winder clear over to the right side, move it clear over to the right. What that's going to do is the motor is only going to run this bobbin spindle it's not going to move the needle on the machine. So if we just press on our presser foot, you'll see just the bobbin spindle is going to move. And the needle did not move at all. So I'm going to disengage that, move it over to the left, and we're going to thread our bobbin. Now, your machine will come with certain bobbins, and you need to use the bobbins that come with your machine. Some are going to be plastic, like this one, and some might be metal. If you look at the bobbin, it has a little hole in here, actually 2 holes. What you're going to do is you're going to take your thread and go in from the middle and up to the top through the hole. And then you're going to hold on to that tail. We're going to put the bobbin on the bobbin spindle and make sure it's all the way down. We're going to move it to the right to engage it. And then we're going to lightly press on the presser foot and start making our bobbin. And you'll notice I was still holding on to this tail. If you let go of the tail, then you can lose the thread and it won't wind around the bobbin. So once you've gone a few ways around the bobbin, we're going to cut the thread off and just continue making the bobbin with as much thread as you want on it or completely full. Once your bobbin is as full as you'd like it, move the bobbin spindle back over to the left and then cut your thread. I would read your instruction manual for the directions on your type of bobbin and bobbin holder. Mine is a drop-in bobbin, but on your machine, you might actually have a side bobbin holder, which is usually on the front of the machine. So to put the bobbin in, I'm going to move the little lever and pop off the lid. And I would also follow the directions for your type of machine as to how the bobbin goes into the machine. On my machine, I want to hold the bobbin so that it makes the letter P. So you can see the letter P. So I'm going to drop it in. And then I'm going to take the tail and hold on to the bobbin. And I'll take the tail and I'm going to put it under this little metal bar. Just slide the thread over. And then we're just going to leave that and we're going to start threading the machine. So if you've just gotten done making a bobbin, the top of your machine and your thread will look like this. We don't want your thread to be going through the bobbin tension discs when you're threading the machine. This is only for the bobbin. So we're going to unwind this. And since we're changing colors for our top thread, I'm going to take the red thread off and I'm going to put the black on. You'll need to read your instruction manual for your sewing machine. It'll tell you which way your thread needs to go on the spindle holder. Mine needs to come over the top. The thread is coming over the top of the spool, but the thread comes from underneath. So we're going to put our thread on. And then if you have a smaller spool of thread, these 𝗪𝗛𝗻𝗻s are a smaller spool. You can use the other side of the cap to hold the thread in place. And you don't want it on too tight. You want the thread to be able to roll off easily. So your machine may have some instruction guides on it for how to thread it. Mine has this guide. It starts here at number 1. So we're just going to follow the numbers. We're going to go through the metal guide number 1. We're going to go through number 2. And then most machines, when you thread it, you'll be going, starting from the top, you'll go down and then you'll come back up. So step number 3 is we go down. Step number 4, we go around. So once you come back up to the top of the machine, you'll get to the thread take up lever. And my thread is on the right side of it, so I'm going to bring it to the left, following the directions, and then I'm going to pull it. Actually, I'm going to use 2 hands. I'm going to pull it so it pops to the front. Once you have the thread in the thread take up lever, you're going to bring the thread down the front of the machine. And here's our number 6. It's this metal guide right here. And we want the thread to go behind the metal guide. And then below that, right above the needle, is another smaller metal guide. And I'm going to use 2 hands. I'm going to get the thread behind that metal guide also. And then we're going to take our thread, and going from the front to the back, we're going to try to thread our needle. Sometimes it's easier than others. I'm going to pull this out, get my hand out of the way. So I'm going to pull the thread towards the back of the machine, holding the thread out from the front, just to help guide it. And now we've got our machine threaded. Now that you've got your machine threaded and your bobbin in the bobbin holder, we need to get the bobbin thread up through this hole where the needle goes, so that the bobbin thread ends up being on the top of the machine. So to do this, with my left hand, I'm going to lightly hold both of the top and bottom threads. I'm going to turn the flywheel on the side of the machine towards me so that the needle goes down. I'm going to make it 1 full turn. I'm going all the way down, bringing the needle back up. And you can see where my thread is now, the black thread on top of the bobbin. We're going to bring it up, and we're going to let it bring the bobbin thread clear through that hole. You can see it starting to come up. Now I'm going to take the top thread and kind of pull that loop. Sometimes I need to use scissors to kind of get it out of there. And now you've got your bobbin thread and your top thread both all set to sew, and they're both towards the back of the machine. Then I'm going to place my bobbin cover back on. Now that we've got our machine threaded, we're going to start sewing. First, I wanted to show you the different stitches on my machine. Most of the time, I will just use the straight stitch, and that's the stitch I'm going to show you first. I also wanted to talk to you about stitch length and what stitch length should you put your machine. Most of the time, I use a medium stitch length for almost everything. The only time I would use a longer stitch length is when I want to baste something together that I know I'm going to sew again later with a regular stitch length. I hardly ever use a really small stitch length for anything. When you're first learning how to sew, it's easier to sew on a nice cotton fabric it will be less frustrating for you than if you tried to learn to sew with knit fabric or a silk fabric. So to start our straight stitch, we're going to put our fabric under the presser foot and lower the presser foot down. I'm going to put the needle down, holding the threads in the back, and then I'm going to press on the foot pedal to start making my straight stitch. Your sewing machine foot pedal is kind of like your gas pedal on your car. If you have a light touch and lightly press, you're going to sew slower. And then if you press down harder, you're going to sew faster. When you're first starting out, excuse me, it's better to just kind of have a light touch and try and go slow until you're used to how the machine works. So using your scrap piece of fabric, just continue making several rows of your straight stitch. I'm using my hands to kind of help guide the fabric, but again, you want to make sure you don't get your fingers too close to the needle. And just let the feed dogs pull the fabric through. When you get to the end of your stitch line, you want to use the flywheel and turn it towards you and bring the thread take up lever so that it's in its highest position, and your needle then is in its highest position too. This is really helpful for later on when you start sewing a new stitch line. If this is not all the way up, your needle will probably come unthreaded. So now that we're at the end of our stitch line, we're going to release the presser foot, bring it up, and I'm going to pull my fabric out away from the machine. And then I'm going to cut off both of the threads, the bobbin thread and the top thread. And you want to make sure that you leave plenty of thread, again, so that you don't lose the threads going through the needle. The needle won't come unthreaded. Now I'm going to show you how to use a straight stitch to sew two pieces of fabric together. And usually you want your fabric, your right sides together, so that when you turn the seam out, your right sides will be out and your seam will not be seen. When I'm sewing two pieces of fabric together, I like to pin every so often to help hold the fabric. I like to put my pins in, it's called pin in. So the pin head is actually off of the fabric, and when I'm sewing, I can easily pull it out. If the pin is this way, it's going to be, I have to reach across the fabric and it's harder to pull the pin out. So this is just the way I like to pin. I just pin in. We're going to take our two pieces of fabric and we're going to put them under the presser foot. And now that we're making a seam, I wanted to talk a little bit about the seam allowance. For most of my projects, for home decor projects, I use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And on my machine, it is very hard to see where the 1/2 inch mark is. It's right in here between the 3/8 and the 5/8. To make it easier to know where my 1/2 inch seam allowance should be, I like to use a little magnet, and I put it right on the 1/2 inch mark. And then I have a guide for my fabric that it's much easier to follow. So I'm going to take my first pin out. You always want to make sure you take your pins out and you don't sew over them, because you can break your needle and it's just not a good idea. So I'm going to start at the edge of the fabric. I'm going to put my presser foot down. I'm going to go forward a couple of stitches. Then I'm going to use my reverse lever and I'm going to back stitch a few stitches to the edge of the fabric. Release the reverse lever and then I'm going to go forward again. So what that has done is it has actually, the back stitching has made a knot for me at the edge of the fabric. So the two pieces of fabric should stay together because of that knot. Now I'm just going to continue on down the piece of fabric. And again, when I get to a pin, I take it out. I wanted to talk to you about how to hold your fabric when you have two pieces of fabric also. What happens is your feed dogs, which are the things that are pulling your fabric underneath the presser foot, they're pulling your fabric towards the back of the machine, and the presser foot wants to kind of push the top fabric towards you. So pinning your fabric helps keep those layers even. But the other thing that helps is to hold your fabric with your thumb underneath and your fingers on top in the front of the machine, and then hold on to the fabric behind the needle, behind the presser foot. And you're not pulling your fabric, you're just holding it tightly and letting the feed dogs bring the fabric through the machine. You want to make sure that you stop well away from the needle. You don't want your needles or your fingers too close to the needle. And then we're just going to continue sewing to the end of the fabric. Once I get close to the end, I'm going to go close to the edge of the fabric. I'm going to reverse and then come forward again to do a locking back stitch on this end of the fabric. I'm going to reverse and come forward again. When I'm done stitching, then we're going to raise the presser foot and again bring the fabric out. And I didn't do this exactly the way I should have. My needle is up, but my take-up lever is not in the highest position, and I should have stopped and raised this up. So I'm going to turn the flywheel so you can see it should have been in this position when I pulled the fabric out. So now I'm going to cut my threads again a little ways away from where my needle is, so I have a tail that's plenty long. In this next lesson, I'm going to show you how to turn the corner if you're making a pillow. So I've cut two pieces of fabric and I've put them right sides together, and we're just going to make this small pillow so that I can show you how to turn the corner. Because I want to leave an opening in the bottom to put the pillow form in, I'm going to actually start stitching in the middle of the fabric on the bottom side. So I'm going to take my pin out, I'm going to put my fabric underneath the presser foot, lower the presser foot, And I'm going to do my back stitch where I go forward a couple stitches, reverse, and then go forward again. When I get close to the corner, I'm going to want to stop away from this edge the same distance as what my seam allowance is, a 1/2 inch. So you're going to kind of have to eyeball it a little bit. One thing that helps is if you hand do it by turning the flywheel towards you. That way you can slowly get up to the corner. And when you think you're about a 1/2 inch away, you can kind of test it. You can put you need your needle all the way down. You want to raise your presser foot, and then you're going to turn your fabric. And we're a little bit further than a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to go one more stitch. I'm going to put my foot back down, turn my flywheel towards me, do one more stitch, and again I want my needle in my fabric as low as it will go. I'm going to raise my presser foot, and then I'm going to turn the fabric. And this time I'm right against my seam allowance magnet guide, so I'm good. I know this is a 1/2 inch away, so I'm going to lower my presser foot and continue up the next side. Again, when I get to a pin, I want to take it out. When I'm close, I'm going to hand turn the flywheel. Make sure my needle is down, lift up my presser foot, and turn the fabric. Put the presser foot back down, and then continue on around the rest of my fabric. I'm going to stop at the bottom and back stitch again. Sewn around the rest of the pillow. I've gone around the 4 corners, and I'm coming up to my final pin. And again, I'm going to stop sewing about right here so that I have enough space to turn my pillow and insert the pillow form or the batting. So I'm just going to continue on. When I get to where I want to stop, I'm going to reverse and then go forward again a couple of stitches. I'm going to raise my needle so that the take-up lever is at its highest point, the needle's at the highest point. Lift up the presser foot and again pull the fabric out away from the machine and cut both of the threads. Now that we've got our stitch line for our pillow, we already cut the ending thread, but you also want to cut the threads for where you started your stitching. So we're just going to cut the top and bottom threads. And because we're making a pillow, I wanted to show you about turning. And what that basically means is you want to turn your fabric right side out. But first, we're going to clip the corners on our pillow. And what that does is it gets the extra bulk out from the corner so that when you turn it, you don't have as much bulk in that corner. When you turn, what I like to use for corners is it's called that purple thing. And it's got this handy, I don't know what you call it, square at the top. And you put that inside and then push the seam out. And if you are using thread that matches your fabric, your stitches will not show as much as mine are showing. In this next lesson, we're going to talk about how to make a hem. There are going to be times when you're going to need a hem, whether for the bottom of your pants or a tablecloth or a drapery, a shower curtain. You want a nice finished edge on the back side of the fabric. I like to do a double hem, so I've turned my fabric 1.5 inches so that my raw edge is in that fold. So it's a double hem. So it's 1.5 inches of fabric in the middle and 1.5 inches of fabric on the outside. You can make your hems whatever size you need for your project. Since we're doing a hem and not a seam allowance, we are going to want to stitch very close to this folded top edge of the hem. You're going to kind of have to eyeball it on your machine. What I'm going to do is try to line up this folded edge with this opening, the left side of the opening. So I'm just going to run along as I sew my hem, trying to keep my fabric right there. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can always use your magnet where you need it to be and then follow the fabric. The fabric will follow right along and make the line of stitching where you need it. So to sew our hem, we've got our fabric under our presser foot. We're going to put our needle down and do another back stitch. So we're going to go forward. I'm going to take my first pin out. Go forward. Just a few stitches. Reverse. And then forward again. Again, you want to use your hands to kind of guide your fabric as you're going along. And take the pins out as you go too. On the other end of your fabric, you're going to want to do a back stitch also. So I'm going to go forward again a couple of stitches and reverse and forward. I'm going to raise my needle to the highest position and making sure that our take-up lever is in the highest position. Lift up the presser foot and pull the fabric away and clip our threads. Then you're going to want to go back to your beginning and clip those threads also. There's the back side of your hem, and then here's the front side. Next, we're going to talk about top stitching. And top stitching is using 1 or 2 rows of stitching along the top and bottom of your fabric. The most common way or reason I would use this would be if I'm making napkins or placemats or a table runner. And what it does is it will hold your seam nicely. Another way you can use top stitching is if you're making a strap for a bag. It'll make the strap stronger if you've got your stitch lines on the strap. So we're going to pretend that we're making either a table runner or a placemat. I've sewn 2 pieces of fabric together, right sides together, and then I've ironed my seam, and I'm going to place my fabric with the seam next to my seam guide. And I've placed my seam guide at 1/2 inch. So my needle will be stitching a 1/2 inch away from my seam. I'm going to again lower the presser foot, put my needle down. I'm going to do a back stitch. Again, kind of guiding the fabric with my hands and letting the feed dogs pull the fabric through, but kind of keeping a hold of both my layers. Again, I'll backstitch. Raise my needle all the way up, raise the presser foot, and then cut my threads on this first line of stitching. I also cut my threads at the beginning of the stitching also. So we've got our first line of stitching a 1/2 inch away from my seam. Now we're going to make another row of stitching 1/4 inch away from the first stitch line. So it's going to actually divide in half your seam allowance. So on my machine, it's very hard to use the magnet seam guide for 1/4 inch. So what I have figured out that I need to do is I'm using this line on my presser foot. I'm lining it up with my 1/2 inch seam line. And when I do that, I'm going to put my fabric in there. That will place my needle right in between the stitch line and the seam. So I'm going to do another back stitch. Again, I'm trying to keep this indented line here on the presser foot kind of even with my 1/2 inch seam line. When I get to the end, I'm going to back stitch. Raise my needle up, and I ran out of bobbin thread, and that will happen sometimes. What I'll need to do is just put more thread on my bobbin and continue down the rest of the top stitching. But you can see here it makes a nice decorative edge for the whatever you're making, the placemat or table runner. Next, we're going to talk about the zigzag stitch. I don't use a lot of the stitches on my machine, the decorative stitches, but I do occasionally use a zigzag stitch. I use it a couple of different ways. I need it when I make buttonholes, which we're going to talk about next. And the other way I use a zigzag stitch is I zigzag back and forth over a piece of dental floss or a string, and then I use that to make gathers, a gathered ruffle. So I'm just going to sew a little bit of a zigzag stitch so that you can see what is happening. The needle will go back and forth, and then I'll show you what the stitch looks like. Okay, so I'm going to raise my needle, raise the presser foot, and then you can see the zigzag stitch. Next, we're going to learn how to make a buttonhole. You can see I've done one buttonhole here already. And to do my next buttonhole, you need to decide where you want the buttonhole. You need to have your button handy. We're just going to place it where we're going to want it. And I'm using a white chalk marker to mark the top of the button and the bottom of the button. Then in between those two lines in the center, I'm going to draw a straight line. To make a buttonhole, we're going to have to use a buttonhole foot, and your machine should come with one already. So I'm going to take off my regular presser foot, and I'm going to insert my buttonhole foot. And I want to line up the metal bar with the indentation on the machine. So I'm going to lower my presser foot, and I'm going to lower the little lever for the feet, raise my presser foot, and now the buttonhole foot is attached. I've got my threads coming off the back again, and you want to make sure that this little yellow or red mark is on the first mark on the left part of the buttonhole foot. So we're going to put our fabric in where we marked, and we're going to want to start on this bottom part of the buttonhole. So I'm going to insert it, and you can see this middle guide right here. I'm going to make sure that it's lined up with my middle line, this middle line that I made. So let me put my foot down where I think I need it. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so now we're going to go over to the dials, and I'm going to show you how on my machine the dials that I need to get set up to make a buttonhole. First of all, my buttonhole maker is a 4-part buttonhole maker. So to start out, I'm going to be in this middle rectangle where it says 1 at the bottom and 3 on top. That means I'm going to do a bar tack along the bottom of the buttonhole. Then I'm going to switch my dial to number 2 and go up the left side, go back to number 3 and stitch along, do a bar tack along the top, and then move the dial to number 4 and come down the right side. On my stitch length, I have it set where it looks like a buttonhole. And then my stitch width on the top here, I have set it 6. So we're going to hold on to our threads in the back. We're going to put our needle down, and we're going to make a few bar tack stitches along the bottom. We're going to raise the needle all the way up, so the take up lever is all the way up also. And I'm going to move my dial to the number 2 spot on my stitch selector. And now we're going to go up the left side. I'm going to go a little bit slower. I want to stop at my top mark that I made. So my top mark is right there. Now I'm going to switch my stitch selector back to the middle position for number 3 to bar tack at the top. Raise my needle. Just make a few stitches at the top, raise my needle again. Now I'm going to go back to my stitch selector, and I'm going to turn it to the number 4 position. And we're going to come down the right side. We're going to stop at the bottom bar tack. Okay, we're going to raise the needle, raise the presser foot and take our piece of fabric out. There we have our buttonhole. Now I'm not going to cut close to the buttonhole because I'm going to use a needle to make sure that these tags go to the wrong side of the fabric. Take a hand sewing needle and put the tail from the end of your stitching through the needle, the eye of the needle, and just bring your needle down through part of the bar tack and pull that thread then to the back side. So this step is really just hiding that thread, and then on the back side you can just cut the thread. Next we're going to cut our buttonhole open, but before we do that you want to place a pin along the top bar tack, and what that will do is it will keep your seam ripper from going clear through the buttonhole. Then you're going to take your seam ripper, and you're going to make sure that the red ball is on top. You're going to start at the bottom of the buttonhole, and you want to make sure you don't want to cut any of the stitches that you made for your buttonhole. So we're going to go right in the bottom, and then very carefully we're going to cut the buttonhole open. And then you can see how the pin is stopping me from going clear to the top. You take your pin out, and there's your buttonhole. Congratulations! You did it! You finished this Learn How to Sew course. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me on my blog at newtoncustomInteriors.com. And happy sewing! I hope you have fun making lots of different sewing projects. Thanks for joining me.